Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the past right through the creaking gates of a medieval castle. But I have to warn you, as soon as the portcullis begins to rise and the drawbridge groans open, something hits you. Hard. It's not a lance or a battle cry, it's the smell. Thick, ancient, and utterly inescapable. The air is soupy with the scent of mud manure, old wood, and something you can't quite place but instantly wish you hadn't noticed. You're not even inside yet, and already you're wondering if your 21st century nose is about to betray you. Spoiler it will. You probably won't survive this olfactory journey with your appetite or dignity intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the current time in the comments, because if you're listening to this while trying to fall asleep, well, let's just say things are about to get musky. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're approaching the outer bailey of the castle now. A cluster of buildings stretches in a sort of defensive semicircle, framed by rough-cut stone walls and looming towers that cast long shadows across the uneven dirt. You'd like to admire the medieval architecture, but you're too busy squinting from the eye-watering stink. It begins subtly, a sharp tang of something fermented, maybe wine or rotting fruit. Then you catch a whiff of old leather, unwashed skin and horse dung. A trio of pigs trots by, their curly tails, flicking up clumps of mud that you very much hope is only mud. Somewhere nearby a dog barks, then whines. And beneath it all, woven into every breath, is a smell like damp cellar mixed with sweat and cooked onions left too long on the stove. You breathe through your mouth, it doesn't help. And no one around you seems to mind. Children chase geese with glee. A soldier leans on his halberd, idly chewing something you hope isn't rat. A merchant sells eels from a slatted cart, and yes, you can smell them before you see them. You're beginning to understand this isn't just a momentary stench. This is air in medieval terms. Now your eyes are drawn to the moat. Romanticized in films, it looks more like a stagnant trench. Flies hover in slow, lazy clouds over the green surface. A dead fish floats belly up beside what may be a boot or someone's lunch, or both. And the smell, imagine a soup made from cabbage pond scum, and questionable decisions. That's the moat on a good day. The drawbridge itself is slick with mud and, well, other things. People wipe their boots half-heartedly as they pass, but it's clear no one expects anything to stay clean for long. The guards don't even flinch as a child squats on the edge to relieve himself. You take a step back. Welcome to medieval sanitation where privacy is optional and dignity is a luxury. A few more steps and you're inside. The smell intensifies like a punch. You flinch involuntarily. Someone nearby chuckles. First time they ask. You nod, still fighting your gag reflex. You get used to it, they say. But you don't believe them. Historians still argue whether people in the Middle Ages were truly nose-blind to their surroundings or simply accepted the ever-present funk as part of daily life. Some suggest that without modern hygiene standards, the contrast between clean and dirty didn't exist in the same way. To medieval noses, the castle might not have smelled bad, just normal. But to you, it's a sensory ambush. Every breath feels like a dare. You want to flee, but also you're weirdly fascinated. How did people live like this? How did nobility knights, cooks, servants, children, all under one stone roof, deal with such constant, overwhelming odours? Here's a quirky tidbit in one famous medieval romance. A knight was described as being so clean his armpits smelled like violets. Violets. Either that's poetic exaggeration or Sir Ro's armpits was the outlier of the century. And yet, despite the smell, or maybe because of it, the place is alive. Vibrant in a way modern spaces aren't. You see chickens strutting across the courtyard, a blacksmith hammering away near the stables, women weaving, men sharpening weapons, children laughing. The castle breathes, stinks, and pulses with life. It may not smell good, but it is real. You step toward the inner gatehouse. The wind shifts. A new wave of scent rises, burning wood, something greasy, maybe a roasted animal, but also something sour. You're not sure if it's coming from the kitchen or someone's armpit. You hope never to find out. And as you take it all in, one thing becomes abundantly clear. You're going to need a strong stomach, a weak nose, and maybe your own personal cloud of rosewater if you plan to survive the rest of this visit. So take a breath if you dare. We're only just getting started. You pass under the arch of the inner gatehouse, and it swallows the last hints of fresh air you didn't know you'd been clinging to. From here on, it's castle proper. Thick stone walls curve inwards, muffling sound and trapping scents in a way that somehow amplifies them. You step into the main courtyard, and you're immediately hit by a wall of air that feels dense. Not hot, necessarily, but heavy, like someone tried to stuff a stew into your nose. Every surface here tells a tale. The cobblestones under your feet are uneven, glossed with the footprints of 1,000 muddy boots, and the droppings of birds, cats and creatures you don't care to identify. There's a well in the centre, but before you can think of water as refreshing, the breeze carries over a scent that feels like sour socks dunked in broth. You realise with a small gulp that the well is likely shared for drinking, washing, and who knows what else. Historians still debate whether medieval wells were truly as contaminated as they seem, or if the human stomach back then was just built differently. You make your way toward the keep, the castle's heart passing open doors and archways. From one, the kitchen spills out, warmth, smoke, and a scent cocktail that can only be described as unhinged dinner party. It's food, technically, but tangled in so many other smells that you can't separate roast from rot. Meat sizzling over flames smells good, sure, but then there's the lingering odour of old grease cabbage water. And maybe mouldy bread being steamed back to life. And let's talk about that bread. You pass a baker's apprentice carrying a basket of rolls, and at first it's a relief, finally, something vaguely appetizing. But as the boy scurries past you, notice his clothes are stiff with flour and sweat, and there's a raw yeasty funk clinging to him that's hard to unsmell. You suddenly wonder how long ago those rolls were baked and whether the rats gave their blessing first. A pair of kitchen boys dash by holding buckets. You freeze, the buckets slosh. And before you can step away, one tips slightly and something suspiciously brownish spills out, splattering near your boots. The boys laugh. You don't? You realise with slow horror that food scraps, wastewater and worse are often just dumped outside, sometimes straight into the courtyard, sometimes from windows above. Yes, that's right. Waste disposal here is vertical. The classic garderobe, the medieval toilet, is essentially a chute poking out the side of the wall. If you're lucky, it drops into a cesspit. If you're unlucky, it lands in the moat, or the street, or brace yourself onto someone walking below. People genuinely used to shout Gardy-loo before emptying chamber pots out the window. And if they didn't, well, that's your problem now. Quirky fact, some castles use dried moss or hay for toilet paper. Others, more lavish, used wool cloth scraps. But for many, it was just their hand. Let that sink in. Then imagine living in a society where no one washes their hands properly. Ever. Yeah. Suddenly, medieval feasts don't sound so appetizing. You walk past the kennels. The smell is aggressive. Dogs, big ones bred for hunting or guarding, pant behind iron bars. They're noble beasts, but their bedding is straw-soaked with who knows what, and the smell of wet fur and old meat clings like a curse. One of them lifts its leg and you take several steps back, fast. Somewhere nearby, a woman is boiling laundry. That should be encouraging, right? Clean clothes. But the water is reused. The lye soap smells harsh and chemically like ashes and fat, which it literally is, and the steam rising from the cauldron smells like the ghost of dirty socks. Still, it's better than nothing. Most people only wash their clothes a few times a year, if that. Bathing is even rarer. There's a myth that medieval people never bathed. That's not entirely true. Public bathhouses existed and some nobles bathed semi-regularly. But inside castles, hot water was a luxury. Heating it meant burning vast amounts of wood. So people mostly wiped down with cloths, perfumed their bodies with oils, or simply embraced the musk. A passing nobleman adjusts his fur cloak and you catch a brief scent of cloves and something floral. Rosewater, a medieval favourite for masking body odour. Wealthier individuals dabbed it on their necks, wrists, even clothes. But even the finest perfume can't completely conquer weeks of built-up sweat. The result: a strange blend of sophistication and funk. You resist the urge to wrinkle your nose. You duck under a low arch and find yourself in the chapel. The air is cooler, filtered by stained glass windows, and there's incense burning somewhere. Finally, something pleasant, frankincense, and myrrh cover a lot of sins. But even here, the stone pews are worn smooth by damp robes and the kneeling cushions. Well, they've seen things. Historians still argue whether religious spaces were truly cleaner in the Middle Ages, or if that's just a myth we project backward. Yes, priests and monks often emphasized purity, but when everyone's trudging around in the same mud and sharing the same fleas, even holy ground can smell a little worldly. You linger for a moment, letting the incense carry you away until someone coughs behind you, a wet, rattling sound that makes you instinctively step sideways. You glance back. The man looks pale, sunken. Maybe sick, maybe dying. Suddenly, the incense isn't enough. And that's when it hits you. The smell isn't just about dirt. It's about people. Crowded living people, most of them unwashed, some of them sick, all of them crammed into the same stone shell. There are no air purifiers, no ventilation, just walls and wood and centuries of breath. You're starting to understand. The medieval castle is a marvel of stone and steel, but it's also a living thing. It breathes. It sweats. And yes, it stinks. You follow a narrow passage off the main courtyard and suddenly the air changes again, but not for the better. It gets warmer, thicker, the kind of warmth that doesn't comfort, but clings. This corridor is part of the servants' passage, a cramped artery of the castle, designed not for grand entrances but for function, and it smells like something between old potato-singed hair and wet wool that's been stuffed in a sack too long. Someone brushes past you and their tunic is damp with sweat despite the stone walls. That's when you realise this part of the castle never really dries out. The cold, thick stones absorb moisture and keep it. Mould blooms in tiny cracks. The scent isn't overpowering like the kitchens or the garderobe, but it's persistent, earthy, musty, and somehow worse because it's subtle, like the walls are rotting inward and no one noticed. A rat darts by, bold, almost casual. It stops to sniff at a fallen breadcrumb near a sack of barley, then disappears into a hole in the wall that looks too small for its body, but isn't. You suddenly understand why cats are prized here, not for cuddles, but for pest control. Still, even the best mouser can't keep up with the sheer volume. Grain stores are always in danger. That earthy, peppery tang in the air, some of it's spoiled flour, some of it is rat droppings. There's a reason medieval kitchens used so many spices. Yes, some were status symbols, but many were practical. They covered up the taste and smell of slightly off food. That smoked sausage hanging from the hook might be 2 weeks old. That pot of stew bubbling over a low flame. It's probably been reheated for days. One pot, endless mystery. Some cooks swore by perpetual stew. Just keep adding new ingredients and hope for the best. Historians still argue whether this was a conscious culinary practice or just a survival tactic. Either way, it's the olfactory equivalent of Russian roulette. You duck into a side room and find yourself in the armoury. Now here's a whole new kind of smell. Metal has its own tang-sharp, dry, almost sour. Mix that with oiled leather, sweaty gambesons, those padded underarmours, and the ever-present scent of smoke from the forges, and you've got a nasal cocktail that feels like inhaling a weapons rack. You spot a young squire struggling to polish a suit of chainmail. Every link must be oiled or rust sets in and fast. The oil is made of animal fat, thick and sticky, and it smells like it's been through 3 campaigns. And a butcher shop. He wipes his forehead with a sleeve, leaving a black smear. And you're reminded again, hygiene isn't just rare, it's impractical. If you're cleaning armour, you're not cleaning yourself. He nods at you and smiles, revealing teeth that would make a modern dentist faint. Not rotting, just uneven yellowed and surrounded by pink swollen gums. Oral hygiene in castles. Not really a thing. Some chewed mint or used frayed twigs to clean their teeth. Others just didn't. Toothaches were common. So were extractions with no anaesthetic. That lingering vinegar note in the air, Could be someone rinsing their mouth. Could be wine gone bad. Could be both. The armory opens into a larger hall, a training area where squires and soldiers spar with wooden swords. The thud of impact echoes off the walls, and with it comes the rich, sour aroma of sweat baked into old cloth. You know that scent the one gym socks get when they're left in a car too long? Imagine that, but multiplied by 20, then simmered gently under a roof of wooden beams and dust. That's what you're walking into. One knight is removing his helm. Literal steam rises from his head as he peels off the padding. The sweat darkens his collar and he fans himself with a gloved hand. You catch a whiff and your nose flinches before your brain registers why. That's not just fresh sweat. That's hours-old sweat soaked into linen, rubbed into leather, and sealed inside a metal can for maximum fermentation. If body odour had a warning label, this would be it. Fringe fact. For you, some nobles believed sweat was healthy, even divine. The body expelling bad humours, they called it. So, washing too often, that might block your body's natural process. Seriously, that was a thing. You head up a flight of stone steps worn smooth in the centre by centuries of feet. Here the air is thinner but no fresher. The smell of stone dominates cold, slightly metallic, but still laced with hints of human presence. Footsteps echo, so do other things, whispers, coughs, the occasional sneeze that sounds suspiciously wet. You instinctively step aside, not wanting to be part of that particular time travel experience. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretches ahead. Tapestries line the walls, dampening the noise, but also trapping dust mildew and occasionally insects. They're beautiful, sure, rich dyes and fine needlework. But lean too close and you'll realise that cloth this old and rarely washed has a scent all its own. A blend of smoked sheep and centuries of stale air. You pause at a window slit hoping for a breeze. There is one faint but real. It carries the smell of the moat, algae mud, and something disturbingly fishy. You don't want to know. Really, you don't. Still, you inhale like a castaway finding shore. But then a gust of wind from the opposite direction brings it all rushing back, sweat smoke, stew, rot iron, and hay. You stagger slightly dazed. The castle doesn't just smell, it layers its smells, like a lasagna of human survival. And you haven't even seen the dungeons yet. You finally gather your composure and press onward deeper into the castle's veins. The hallway narrows again, the stones more uneven here, and the ceiling starts to slope downward. It feels less like architecture and more like you're entering something's belly. A heavy iron door looms ahead. You know what's behind it even before you get close. It's the dungeon. It creaks open, slowly protesting with the long groan of metal hinges that haven't seen proper oil in a decade. The air that hits your face is like a slap from the underworld, thick, sour, and unrelenting. The smell is indescribable at first, but then it breaks apart note by note into something far more vivid. Urine. Human waste, mould, damp straw, the unmistakable tang of dried blood. And despair. Despair has a scent, you learn. Its stale breath and days-old sweat, a stillness that clings to fabric and hair and skin like a second layer. You step inside. Or maybe you don't. Maybe your feet just happen to keep moving while your brain screams for a reverse gear. The dungeon is a series of cramped cells, tiny, dark and damp. No torches burn here, only slivers of daylight from barred grates overhead. You hear water dripping somewhere. It doesn't stop. The walls are wet to the touch and the floor is muddy in places. Muddy or worse. In one corner of the nearest cell, a pile of straw sits where a person once slept or tried to. It's blackened with mildew. And it smells like it. Back then, straw wasn't replaced regularly. It was added to flattened and left to fester. Body lice. Constant companions. You feel an itch just thinking about it. A skeleton lies chained to the far wall. Not real, not here, but in your mind, vivid and horribly plausible. You imagine someone huddled there in winter breath, fogging the air, shaking from cold hunger, or both. Did they beg for water? Did they scream? No one heard. No one wanted to. Historians still argue whether dungeons were as widespread and brutal as legends claim. Some say they were rare, used only for political prisoners. Others insist they were commonplace, crude tools of fear and control. Either way, the smell confirms something. Whatever happened here, it wasn't humane. You climb back up quickly, stomach churning. The light outside the dungeon seems brighter, almost holy. You're back in the lower hall now, passing through another service area, the laundry. You think this might offer some relief. Nope. Turns out laundry in a medieval castle doesn't smell like lavender. It smells like boiled urine. Literally. They used stale urine called lant to clean cloth. Ammonia-rich and pungent, it broke down grease and filth like medieval detergent. It also broke down your nostrils. The laundry vats are huge and always warm, not warm like a spa, warm like who left the soup out for a week. There's steam, yes, but it carries the scent of centuries of bodily residue. The clothes being washed here aren't exactly dainty linens either. They're stiff with grime, some crusted with who knows what. Washing them is less about freshness and more about less stench. A washerwoman passes by with a load of tunics. She's young, but her hands are already cracked and raw from the lye and the cold. Her apron smells faintly of smoke and strong ale, probably her only comforts. Some believe medieval people just didn't care about cleanliness. That's not entirely true. They did care, but their understanding of hygiene was different. Water could be dangerous to drink, and bathing too often was believed by some to weaken the body. So they washed in parts, hands, face, armpits. Full-body baths were rare, often a luxury. And clothes. They were expensive. Washing them wore them out, so they didn't wash them often. The laundry room opens into a drying area. Rows of clothing hang from ropes, and for a brief moment the scent improves. Cloth in open air smells neutral, even faintly grassy. But then you catch a whiff of something else, something burning. You follow your nose and find yourself back near the kitchens. Only now you're near the smokehouse. Long slabs of meat hang above a pit of smouldering embers, and the air is dense with it. Smoke grease and char, all baked into the very beams overhead. It's not unpleasant, But it's aggressive, like stepping into a barbecue restaurant and never leaving. A thick slab of bacon drips fat onto the coals. It sizzles and spits, releasing an aroma that's half delicious and half dangerous. You realize that the fire never really goes out here. Sparks drift lazily upward, and the walls are blackened with soot. You cough. It sticks in your throat. Fun fact: the constant exposure to smoke helped preserve not only food, but sometimes the people. Lungs. Not so lucky, many castle dwellers developed chronic respiratory issues, especially children and kitchen workers. That persistent wheeze you hear from the cook. It's not just age. Historians still debate whether smoke was a conscious antimicrobial strategy or just a byproduct of survival. Whatever the case, it's scented. Everything hair clothes, even love letters. Imagine writing poetry while smelling like smoked eel. The path curves again, taking you toward the noble wing. It's quieter here. Quieter doesn't mean cleaner, but at least the smells are more intentional. There's beeswax used to seal letters and polish furniture. Rosewater splashed onto handkerchiefs, herbs dried and stuffed into pouches to mask the nearby rot. It's almost enough to fool you. Almost. But underneath the elegance, the rot always waits. You drift into the noble wing following that fleeting promise of refinement. The hallway widens. The walls here are adorned with faded tapestries, scenes of hunting parties, saints and lions that look more like shaggy greyhounds. Under your feet, rushes are spread thick across the flagstone floor. At first, they seem charming, almost quaint nature's own carpeting. But don't breathe too deeply. The rushes aren't replaced often. Maybe once a season. Instead, fresh layers are added on top of old ones, creating a soft mulch of discarded food scraps, crushed herbs, mouse droppings, lost buttons, and the occasional tooth. Yes, a tooth. You spot one half buried and yellowed. Is it from a guest, a servant, or someone who didn't make it through the last feast? The floor smells faintly of thyme and rosemary, an attempt to cover something deeper. You take another step, and the scent changes subtly but unmistakably. Beneath the herbs lies a fermented undercurrent of mold-spoiled beer and old meat. Rushes were more than decoration. They trapped dirt and moisture, absorbed spills and muffled sound. And while the intent was practical, the result was a bacterial wonderland. Think of it as a compost pile. You live on. A servant scuttles past holding a brass bowl filled with water. Not for drinking, this is hand-washing water probably meant for a lord or lady preparing for dinner. You peek inside. The water's already murky. There's a thin film on the surface and something floating, a dead fly maybe. Hygiene here is more ritual than reality. In the main chamber, your nose is teased by a new odour perfume. Heavy floral cloying, the kind that clings to your throat. It was common for nobles to douse themselves in scented oils, pomanders and dried flowers. After all, bathing was infrequent, maybe once a month or even just a few times a year. You do the math. So instead they layered scent upon scent, lavender, musk, clove. It's not unpleasant, but it's overwhelming. You wonder how anyone managed to smell anything beneath it. Then again, maybe that was the point. Historians still argue whether the upper class truly believed bathing was harmful or if it was simply impractical due to logistics. Heating water, transporting it, and maintaining privacy in a drafty stone fortress wasn't easy. Plus, there was always the fear that open pores allowed illness to creep in. There's a bathtub tucked into the corner, wooden, ringed with iron, lined with linen. A luxury item. But you wouldn't want to step into it. The water looks suspiciously reused. You suspect it's served more than one noble today. You lean in out of curiosity and immediately regret it. The scent is like wet wool mixed with boiled eggs. You exit into the solar, a smaller, warmer room with more tapestries and a few open windows. Fresh air. For a moment you almost smile, but then a breeze brings in the unmistakable smell of the moat below. Ah, yes, the moat. Let's talk about that. You might think it's filled with fresh water, gently reflecting sunlight and discouraging invaders. Not quite. Most moats, especially around stone castles, weren't pristine pools. They were stagnant, murky, and functioned more like open sewers. Waste from kitchens, chambers, and latrines often flowed directly into them. Some even doubled as refuse pits, dead animals, broken tools, rotten food. There's a story, maybe exaggerated, maybe not of a castle, that dumped its deceased livestock into the moat during a particularly bad winter. The result, a defensive ring of rot. You approach the window. The air carries the moist, sulphurous breath of the moat. It smells like cabbage left out too long, mixed with swamp gas, and something unidentifiable but offensive on a cellular level. Your eyes water slightly. Moats did serve a purpose beyond defense. The stink alone may have discouraged attackers from getting too close. Imagine trying to lay siege while gagging. You move away, blinking. Back inside, a chambermaid passes you carrying a pail. It's sloshing with grey water, half-used washing water, thin with soap and clouded with grime. She's taking it toward the garderobe. Yes, it's time. The castle toilet. It's exactly as exciting as it sounds. You reach the narrow tower that houses the garderobe, literally guarding the robes, since it was often used to hang clothes thanks to the ammonia fumes that killed lice. You appreciate the practicality. You don't appreciate the rest. Inside, there's a stone bench with a hole. Just a hole. It drops straight down to the base of the castle wall, or into a chute that empties into the moat. Either way, the scent is aggressive, acrid, tangy, aged. One whiff and you're very, very awake. Surprisingly, it's not the worst-smelling place you visited, but it is relentless. And because the chute was open air, the smell often wafted back up. On windy days, the scent travelled upward into the noble rooms, that perfume probably doing double duty. There's also a buzzing, flies, always flies, and damp stone. You step back, careful not to touch anything. The floor is slick. You decide not to ask why. Quirky fact, some castles installed double-seated guardrobes, not for romance, for efficiency. You could chat with a friend, or a squire could help you with your robes. No, really. As you leave, you spot a rat, just a flash of grey tail disappearing into the shadows. You shiver. You walk back into the hallway, grateful for the cool stone and the open window ahead. But now you know, this isn't a castle of shining armor and fairy tales. It's a breathing, sweating, fermenting beast. And you're still only halfway through it. You head toward the kitchens now, drawn by the flicker of firelight and what you hope might be the first pleasant smell of this journey. Bread spices. Maybe even a roast, turning on a spit. For the briefest moment, you allow yourself a sliver of optimism. It is misplaced. The scent hits you the moment you cross the archway into the great kitchen. Not terrible exactly, just aggressive. Hot, greasy air chokes the space. You're instantly coated in a thin film of smoke and animal fat. It's like walking into a medieval version of a deep fryer, except no one is cleaning the filters. Open hearths blaze. Massive iron pots bubble ominously over low flames. You have no idea what's in them. Something beige, viscous, and probably centuries ahead of the food pyramid. A pig carcass spins slowly on a spit, its skin blistered and oozing. The smell is meaty, gamey, and too intense, like someone tried to bottle bacon grease and set it on fire. There's also a peculiar sweetness in the air. You track it to a barrel of fermenting fruit possibly destined for a thickened sauce or a dubious dessert. The smell. Halfway between overripe banana and mouldy grape juice. One cook shouts over the din, tossing handfuls of something into a pot. You assume it's seasoning or sawdust, hard to say. Another is plucking feathers from a dead goose, each pull releasing a puff of dander and that unmistakable scent of wet bird. You didn't think wet bird was a smell you'd ever recognize, but here you are. Congratulations. This is the beating, boiling heart of the castle. Fires are constantly burning and everything is coated in soot. The walls are blackened, the ceiling streaked with decades of smoke. You touch a nearby beam and immediately regret it. Your fingers come away grey. You wipe them on your tunic. Now that's medieval authenticity. Here's your historical fact for the night castles employed dozens of cooks, kitchen boys and scullions, all working in a hierarchy stricter than your average high school clique. The head cook had serious power deciding who ate what when and how it was prepared. It was a position of trust and occasionally suspicion. Poison was a very real fear. Which brings you to the pantry. You squeeze past two boys hauling a bloody bucket, don't ask what's inside, and duck into a smaller, cooler chamber. The pantry smelled different, and not in a good way. It's a dense cocktail of dried herbs, cheese-salted meat mildew, and despair. Shelves are lined with wheels of cheese so aged they probably have opinions. One cracks open slightly as you pass, releasing a blast of ammonia and what you can only describe as ancient dairy rage. There's a basket of onions. Some are sprouting, some are melting. You wonder which is worse. The salt pork next to them glistens like candle wax, sweating slightly in the low light. Quirky tidbit in wealthier castles, cooks sometimes added gold leaf to dishes, not for taste of course, but as a flex. The glittering flakes passed straight through the body, exiting the other end unchanged. So yes, somewhere in this very kitchen someone once pooped gold. You make your way to the larder hoping for a bit of fresh air. Instead, you find the meats. Hams hang from hooks cloaked in wax and thyme. Some look edible. Others look like they might whisper secrets in the dark. There's fish too, mostly salted or dried. The scent is layered, salt, decay, sea, and something very, very fishy. You hold your breath and continue. You pass the bakeria. Finally, that warm, yeasty aroma of bread, a moment of peace. But it's fleeting. The oven room is oppressively hot, and the smell of dough mixes with that of scorched wood-burnt flour and a bucket of sourdough starter that's clearly been evolving its own microbiome since the last crusade. You start to back out when you notice something odd dripping. A slow, wet tap, tap, tap. You follow it, half dreading the source. It's a ceiling beam soaked through from something above. It drips into a bucket which is already half full. The liquid is brown, smells faintly of rot and mushrooms. You quickly realise the upstairs guardrobe chute runs directly overhead. Yep, this is seepage. Historians still argue whether this kind of cross-contamination was normal or if this particular kitchen just lost the architectural lottery. Either way, it's clear food safety wasn't invented yet. You head toward the back exit, lungs aching from the heat. The door is cracked open and a breeze licks your face. Blessed relief until you realise it brings with it the smell of the stables. Because of course the kitchens were right next to the stables. Efficient for carting in firewood, hauling out scraps, and ensuring your roast boar always had a hint of horse dung on the side. You stumble outside, grateful to be away from the boiling chaos. But the relief is temporary. Next up, the stables. And you can already smell them from here. You take a deep breath, though honestly not too deep, and follow the rough dirt path toward the stables. The smell intensifies with every step, a sharp blend of ammonia, hay, and something sour that makes your nose crinkle involuntarily. There's no mystery here. You're about to enter a medieval stable, and it's not going to be pleasant. The first thing you notice when you step inside isn't the animals. It's the warmth. Not cozy warmth, but the stifling, humid heat of a room shared by too many bodies. Horses, goats, sometimes even cows, all crammed into wooden stalls, many with their own piles of straw soaked in urine. You can practically taste the urea in the air. It's like someone fermented gym socks in a bottle of vinegar and left it in the sun. You tiptoe carefully over the sticky, straw-covered floor. Every step makes a squelch you don't trust. You want to think it's just mud. You know better. Flies buzz thick around your head, and you instinctively swat at them like you're trying to conduct a very angry orchestra. One lands on your cheek. You flinch. Did that one just crawl out of the manure pile? Probably. Here's your mainstream fact. Horses were essential to castle life, not just for knights, but for messengers' transport and hauling. A large castle could house dozens, sometimes over 100 animals. That meant round-the-clock cleaning was vital, and yet not always achieved. Often the stables were cleaned only when things got really bad. By then the floor was a swamp of waste. There's a boy barely 10 mucking out a stall with a crude wooden shovel. His face is covered with a grimy cloth to filter out the smell, but you can still see the despair in his eyes. You don't blame him. The job involves lifting heaps of dung, some still warm, and slopping them into a cart that smells worse than the stall itself. The cart is wheeled outside only once a day. You're standing close to the wall now, trying to avoid getting too close to a particularly snorty pony. And that's when you spot something moving in the hay. A rat. Not small. Not fast. Just bold. It waddles past like it owns the place, nose twitching as it sniffs for grain or a forgotten crust. Rats were as common in stables as hay, sometimes more so. They lived off spilled food, nesting in corners and breeding at an alarming rate. Some were even blamed for spreading illness among the animals. Not that anyone could prove it then. Quirky tidbit. Some castles kept ferrets or cats specifically for rat control. But there were also bizarre folk methods. Hanging dried owl corpses from the rafters was believed to ward off infestations. Judging by the size of that rat, the owls weren't winning. And it's not just rats. You hear a strange cough, wet, throaty, almost human, and turn to see one of the older horses shivering slightly. Its fur is matted with sweat and flies, and its breath puffs visibly in the stale air. Respiratory illness was rampant in these quarters. Without proper ventilation, disease spread like gossip in a noble court. Historians still argue whether stables were truly the disease hotspots of castle life, or whether that honour goes to the servants' quarters. We'll get there. But there's no denying the stench of sickness in the air. Someone opens a nearby gate and a goat trots past, dragging its chain and leaving behind a little trail of something you won't describe. It makes a beeline for a feed bin and starts chewing noisily. You can't blame it. If you had to live here, you'd eat constantly too, if only to dull the olfactory experience. You edge closer to a corner where a stable hand sleeps curled up on a flattened hay bale. That's right. Some workers slept in the stables. It was warmer than the barracks, and in winter warmth mattered more than dignity. The boy's boots are half off, and his blanket looks like it used to be part of a curtain. You wonder if he still notices the smell. Because that's the thing, you're gagging, but he's snoring. You crouch to examine a small wooden trough. It's full of stagnant water, probably meant for the animals. A green film coats the surface and bugs lazily drift over it. You pull back quickly. You'll stick to whatever water is uphill from here, hopefully way uphill. Before you leave, a mule lets out a loud, echoing bray that startles you so badly you knock over a bucket of, well, let's just say it had layers. The splash hits your shoes. You suppress a sound that isn't quite a scream, but isn't exactly family-friendly either. You need to get out. You step back into the open air, and even the faint scent of the midden heap nearby is better than what you just endured. Your nose is numb, your eyes are watering, and your shoes may never recover. But you're not done yet. Because now you're headed to the laundry. And trust me, wet wool has its own opinions. You're walking briskly now, partly to escape the memory of that bucket splash and partly because you're curious. Castle laundry. That sounds like it might smell. Better. Clean even. You picture breezy linen on clotheslines that sun-warmed, just-washed scent. But then reality taps you on the shoulder and whispers, "This is medieval Europe. Remember?" You round a corner and approach a stone outbuilding near the servants' quarters. You hear splashing scrubbing and the occasional grunt. Welcome to the wash house, or as some historians half-jokingly call it, the kingdom of damp disappointment. The first thing that hits you is not the scent of soap. Oh no, it's wet wool and it hits hard. Wool was the dominant fabric of the time, scratchy thick and highly absorbent. When soaked, it releases an odour that sits somewhere between a soggy sheep and a damp cellar that's never quite forgiven you for visiting. You breathe through your mouth. It doesn't help. The washhouse itself is a dim, echoing room with stone basins and giant wooden tubs. Women are kneeling around the basins, vigorously scrubbing undergarments and tunics with harsh homemade soaps, often a mix of wood ash and animal fat. It's efficient, but not exactly fragrant. You lean over a tub to peek inside and immediately regret it. That greyish water. It's a swamp of body grime, sweat, grease, and the occasional unidentified blob. Mainstream fact, incoming castle laundry was a labour-intensive social task. Women, mostly lower-class servants, washed not only their own clothes, but also those of their employers. High-ranking nobles might have their linens washed weekly, but commoners, once a season if that. Underwear, when it existed, was usually linen and washed more often. Everything else just got aired out. Quirky tidbit urine, yes, again, was sometimes used as a stain remover or even a bleaching agent. Known as chamber lye, aged urine was collected in jugs and poured over laundry to strip grease and whiten cloth. The smell, imagine a vinegar bath left too long in a hot stable. You're welcome. Historians still argue whether chamber lye was common in all castles or reserved for larger, more organised estates. Some argue it was a rare practice, others think it was widespread, but deliberately forgotten by embarrassed chroniclers. You can't help but wonder if it was just a cruel prank someone turned into policy. One woman, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, grabs a shirt and slaps it repeatedly against a wooden paddle. The smacking noise echoes through the room. You notice her eyes are red from soap exposure and steam. Her hands are raw knuckles, cracked. She works rhythmically as if her arms move on muscle memory alone. You wonder how many hours she's been scrubbing and how many more she'll do before nightfall. As you move further in, the heat thickens. This is not a pleasant spa-like steam. It's dense, almost oppressive, filled with the mingled odours of wet cloth, lye, old sweat, and something faintly metallic. One of the tubs bubbles gently over a small fire, boiling water used for deep cleaning bed linens or cloth nappies. You peek inside, then step back fast. The water's brown. You don't ask. You pass a wall, where tunics and shifts hang on pegs dripping steadily onto the floor. Some of them still look dingy despite the effort. Medieval fabrics stained easily, and bright dyes faded quickly. Lye might clean a garment, but it could also eat holes in it if overused. The workers had to strike a careful balance, clean enough not to be shamed in public, but not so scrubbed you'd end up wearing Swiss cheese. Near the far wall you find an unexpected sight, a small pile of lavender bundles. Actual lavender. A rare luxury. Some castles cultivated herbs for scenting linens or disguising harsher smells. In very lucky households, the wash might be lightly scented, though whether it helped much is up for debate. You pick one up and breathe in. It's subtle, very subtle, like a whisper of summer underneath a thunderstorm of mouldy towels. One young girl, maybe 12, is assigned the task of wringing out cloth. She twists a tunic with all her strength, her tiny arms shaking with effort. The water splashes out, spraying her apron. It's exhausting work. And once the wringing is done, clothes are laid out over hedges, stone walls, or ropes strung between buildings to dry weather permitting. When it rained well, they'd try again tomorrow. You glance up. The rafters are damp. Mould clings to the wood in patches. You see cobwebs. A spider scuttles by, looking thoroughly unimpressed by your visit. At this point, you've been inhaling the perfume of the washhouse for nearly half an hour. You're starting to get used to it, which is honestly the most disturbing part. Your clothes feel a bit damp just from the humidity. Your hair sticks to your forehead. A drop of something hits your shoulder from the ceiling, and you pray it's just condensation. You slip outside again, half stumbling into the fresh air. A breeze catches you, and suddenly everything smells clean in comparison, even the stables. But don't get too comfortable. There's one place even worse than the washhouse in a way. You're headed for the garderobe. The medieval bathroom. Oh yes, it's time. You think you're prepared. You've smelled unwashed peasants, rotten food, spoiled chamber pots, and damp wool infused with chamber lye. Surely nothing else in this castle can top the olfactory assault of the washhouse, right? And then you open the door to the garderobe. Your nose immediately files a formal complaint. Let's get one thing straight, the medieval bathroom is not a bathroom. There is no bathtub, no sink, no glossy white porcelain or gently humming fan. This is a hole in a stone bench suspended above a pit, or if you're lucky, a chute that leads to a moat or cesspool. You step into a narrow stone chamber built into the castle wall. There's a bench with a round opening worn smooth by centuries of very personal use. A faint draught seeps in through a shaft below the seat, which would seem pleasant if not for the fact that it carries the scent of centuries. That's right. You're sniffing the ghosts of digested feasts past. Mainstream fact garderobes were the standard waste disposal system in medieval castles, built vertically to allow gravity to do its job. Waste would either fall into a pit called a cesspit, or flow into the moat, or a drainage trench. Some castles had multiple garderobes stacked above each other. Imagine being on the bottom floor. Quirky tidbit, in winter icicles formed in some chutes, and yes, they were sometimes nicknamed poopsicles by modern historians. Whether anyone in the Middle Ages found them funny is up for debate, but it's hard not to picture some poor page boy sliding on frozen filth. Now let's talk smell. The pit below you is essentially a slow-cooking compost pile of human waste. There's no flushing, no regular maintenance. Occasionally the pit is emptied manually by gong farmers, one of the most unfortunate jobs in history. These brave souls, or desperate ones, would wade in and scoop out the mess with buckets, often under cover of night. The odour was so potent that many lived outside city walls to avoid contaminating the air of civilized company. Historians still argue whether garderobe placement, often near kitchens or bedrooms, was a sign of poor planning or just the best option given medieval architecture. Some claim it was to keep waste warm in winter to avoid freezing. Others insist it was due to the convenience of having it close by regardless of smell. Either way, you're sitting in a very aromatic design flaw. You lean over cautiously to peer down the hole. A few flies buzz up to greet you. You recoil. There's a faint, swampy gurgle below. It's both threatening and tired, like something long forgotten is stirring in the depths. Beside the seat, there's a wooden box. You hope for toilet paper. But no, it's full of moss and smooth stones. That's right, medieval toilet hygiene involved whatever was available, moss rags, hay, or your left hand. You look at your palm and mentally apologize. One corner of the chamber is stained dark rainwater, or something worse has leaked through over time. The walls are scratched with graffiti. A knight's name, a crude drawing of what might be a dragon or a roast chicken, hard to say. Even in this private moment, someone felt the need to leave their mark. Above your head, there's a tiny window. Air circulation, light, escape for the smell, but it does little. You try to breathe only through your mouth, but the tang still hits the back of your throat. You gag softly, politely. But here's a little cultural curveball. The word garderobe originally referred to a wardrobe. That's because some nobles believed hanging clothes in the toilet room would help protect them from moths. How the pungent fumes were thought to drive off insects. So your fine velvet cloak might be hung in the same space where your lord took his nightly squat. Efficient, repulsive, very medieval. You step back out of the chamber and take several deep gulps of air. You're getting used to this cycle: investigate, recoil, breathe, repeat. The castle is a labyrinth of fascinating smells, none of them friendly. As you recover, you hear a rustling behind a wooden door down the hall. You follow the noise and find the linen storage room where the castle's precious bedclothes and undergarments are kept. And guess what? They smell too. You step into the linen storage room expecting crisp, clean stacks of fabric. Instead, a faint but persistent musk clings to the air. An odd mix of damp wool mothballs and something faintly sour that tickles your nose and refuses to be pinned down. Castles, after all, were not the fragrant palaces you might imagine. This room is critical. The fabrics stored here were the lifeblood of medieval comfort. Sheets, blankets, tapestries, and undergarments, all painstakingly woven from linen, wool, or occasionally silk, were tucked away here to be fetched and replaced. But unlike your modern closet with climate control and airtight storage, this place is a musty vault, vulnerable to the whims of weather and pests. A mainstream fact, linen was prized in medieval Europe for its breathability and relative ease of cleaning. Nobles especially prized their linens because frequent washing was both a luxury and a health necessity given medieval hygiene practices. But soap was rudimentary, often made from animal fats, mixed with ashes, and washing was a seasonal chore that involved hauling linens to rivers or communal washing areas. Quirky tidbit: to fend off moths and bugs, people sometimes used sprigs of aromatic herbs like lavender or wormwood tucked among their linens. However, scholars still argue whether these herbs truly kept pests away or simply masked the smell of neglect. You run your fingers over the rough weave of a blanket and catch a sudden flutter. An ancient moth disturbed from its long nap takes wing as if protesting your intrusion. You sneeze and it feels like the room itself is holding its breath. Now consider this: medieval nobles often reused their clothes and linens extensively, sometimes wearing the same tunics or bedding for months, if not years. Changing and laundering were luxuries for peasants and even many city dwellers. But in castles, the smell wasn't just from a lack of washing, it was from the sheer volume of cloth in constant use, mixed with sweat smoke and centuries of dust. Historians still debate the extent to which smell affected medieval social behaviour. Some argue the aristocracy was quite aware of their odours and took measures to mask them with perfumes and spices, while others suggest they accepted the stench as part of daily life, because what choice did they have? You suspect it was a bit of both. Like us, really, just with worse air fresheners. From the linen room, your journey takes you back into the main hall, where the scents shift again, this time toward the kitchen. But before you go, you notice a faint yellow stain on a wooden beam, and you wonder, not for the first time, just how many secrets these walls keep. The castle's smellscape isn't just a single note. It's an olfactory symphony of damp stone wood smoke, cooking fires, animal hides, human sweat, and yes, even the lingering ghost of yesterday's garderobe. As you leave the linen room, you remind yourself to take deep breaths outside because, trust me, this is only getting started. You step into the castle's great hall, where the heart of medieval social life beats loudest and smells most distinct. Imagine a cavernous space filled with long wooden tables, roaring hearth fires, and the chatter of knights, ladies, and servants. Now imagine all that activity coupled with the smells of burning wood, spilled ale, roasting meat, and not-so-fresh breath. The Great Hall was the castle's social hub, but it was also a sensory overload. The stone walls absorbed smoke and grease, while dirt and straw strewn across the floor acted like a sponge for spills and refuse. You probably won't survive a full day here without developing a tolerance, or at least a strong stomach. One historical fact: the hearth fire wasn't just for warmth or cooking. It was also a grim necessity to keep the cold stone from dripping with moisture, which created a musty, damp smell that lingered long after the smoke had cleared. Now here's a quirky twist. Some castles installed ventilation holes high in the walls or ceilings called smoke holes to help funnel the thick smoke upward. But historians still argue whether these actually improved air quality or just concentrated the worst smells near the roof. You lean closer to a burnt wooden beam near the hearth and sniff smoky. Yes, but mixed with the acrid tang of burnt fat and overcooked onions. You'd swear there's a hint of old wine and forgotten cheese somewhere in the background. In fact, medieval banquets often involved copious amounts of both, which didn't exactly help the olfactory situation. Socially, the Great Hall was also a place of shared odours. Imagine dozens of people packed together, sweating after battle, or a long journey wearing clothes that had rarely seen soap. There were no personal space zones when it came to smell. It was all mixed in communal and inescapable. Historians still debate whether medieval etiquette included any rules about odour. Was it rude to mention bad smells or just part of everyday life? Some records suggest nobles tried to mask their stench with perfumes, while others show a certain stoic acceptance of their natural odours, like a badge of honour. You catch a whiff of something unexpectedly floral, a sprig of rosemary tucked near the table, probably to cut through the grime. It's a faint comfort, like a tiny oasis in a desert of smells. As you sit on one of the wooden benches, you realise if you think modern crowded places smell bad, you haven't truly experienced medieval castle life. The Great Hall is a mixture of smells that make you appreciate modern plumbing, air fresheners, and frankly, deodorant. You rise careful not to disturb a stray piece of stale bread and head toward the kitchens where the aromas will grow even more intense and complicated. But don't get too hopeful. This isn't a gourmet spa. You enter the castle kitchen expecting warm, inviting smells of roasting meats and fresh bread. Instead, you're greeted by a heady, chaotic mix of smoke, grease, fermenting ale, and something faintly sour that curls your nostrils and sticks stubbornly in your throat. The kitchen was the heart of medieval food preparation, but also a hotspot for odours that would make your modern nose rebel. A key historical fact: medieval kitchens were often separate from the main hall to reduce fire risk, but their chimneys lacked modern ventilation, so smoke and smells often spread throughout the castle's lower levels. Open fires and cauldrons bubbled day and night, churning out fumes and splatters that coated the walls in a greasy film. Quirky tidbit: to mask the less pleasant smells, cooks sometimes burned herbs like rosemary or sage, hoping their fragrance would overpower the kitchen's more pungent aromas. Historians still argue whether this was an effective deodorizing tactic or simply an aromatic distraction from the unavoidable funk. You glance at the food store's barrels of salted fish, cured meats, and stacks of dried legumes. The preserved fish, in particular, released a sharp, almost electric scent, a mix of brine and decay, which could linger on hands and clothes for days. Imagine having to eat that regularly and then try not to offend anyone with your fresh breath. The kitchen also doubled as a workspace for butchery and food preparation, so the scent of raw meat mingled with the smoky air. This combination, along with the constant presence of rodents and flies always drawn to scraps, created a swirling stew of odours that would challenge even the strongest constitution. You might picture the cooks as grim-faced professionals, but in reality their clothes often smelled as bad as the food they prepared. Washing was infrequent, and the line between professional and unwashed blurred easily. Plus, rats and other vermin were regular kitchen visitors, adding a faint musky undertone to the environment. Historians still debate how medieval people's noses adapted to these conditions. Some think they developed a tolerance or even a preference for these scents, while others argue it was a constant source of discomfort only bearable due to necessity and lack of alternatives. You notice a small bunch of dried lavender hanging near the ceiling, likely a last-ditch effort to keep the air bearable. But you suspect the only real relief came when the cooks finally left for the night, taking their smells with them. Stepping out of the kitchen, your clothes pick up a faint residue of smoke and something vaguely sour. You remind yourself to breathe deeply once you're outside the castle walls again. Fresh air at last, though you know you won't have smelled anything quite like this before. You wander into the castle's latrines, an unavoidable chapter in your olfactory journey. These were not your modern sanitized bathrooms. Instead, imagine long benches with holes cut out over a cesspit or moat, shared by dozens of people at once, their aromas mingling into a thick, unmistakable cloud of human reality. Historically, many medieval castles had communal latrines called garderobes, often located in projecting towers or along outer walls where waste dropped directly outside or into a pit. This design meant you sometimes had to hold your breath just to avoid the stench wafting back inside. A quirky fact, some castle latrines were equipped with a seat that was literally a wooden bench with a hole without any privacy barriers, so you sat next to your neighbours with no curtains or dividers. Historians still argue whether this was simply a practical choice, or if medieval people genuinely cared less about privacy. The smell. Well, it's a complex cocktail of sulfur ammonia, damp stone, and the unmistakable funk of decaying matter. If you thought modern public restrooms were bad, you've got another think coming. These places were breeding grounds for flies and other pests who thrived in the warm, moist conditions. You notice the faint aroma of herbs or straw tossed in, occasionally attempts to mask the worst smells or absorb moisture. But in reality, it was a losing battle against the sheer volume of waste. Interestingly, the garderobe also had an unintended cooling effect. In summer, the stone walls would stay cold, providing a kind of crude air conditioning. But this comfort came at the cost of breath-holding and quick exits. Some scholars debate how much the latrine smells penetrated living quarters. Did cold air currents carry them far, or did thick stone walls contain them? There's evidence both ways suggesting castles varied widely in their latrine design and smell management. You take a deep, careful breath and consider how different your modern bathroom experience is. There's plumbing, ventilation, and privacy, all luxuries medieval castle inhabitants lacked. Your nostrils recoil at the thought of enduring these smells daily, much less hosting a feast afterwards. You step out quickly, feeling grateful for the fresh air, but knowing the castle's stink isn't done with you yet. It clings to your skin, clothes, and memories like a stubborn shadow, reminding you that medieval living was as much about enduring odours as it was about defending walls. You now find yourself wandering the castle halls, where the scent of damp stone mixes with the unmistakable musk of sweat and old leather. These corridors, often narrow and poorly ventilated, trap smells like a sponge holds water. Imagine the aroma of soldiers' armour after a long day, metal warmed by the sun's sweat soaking the leather straps, and a faint whiff of rust and grime. A solid historical fact, knights and guards often wore their armour for hours or even days, and cleaning it regularly was difficult. This made the metal and leather a perfect petri dish for odours to develop. The combination of sweat, animal hides, and metal created a unique, pungent scent that hung around long after the wearer left the room. Here's a quirky detail. Some knights believed that the smell of their armour could intimidate enemies, like a natural war stench that said, I've been through battle and I'm not cleaning up just for you. Historians still argue whether this was intentional psychological warfare or just a side effect of medieval hygiene standards. You brush your hand along the stone walls and notice patches of mould and mildew, which add a musty undertone to the air. The lack of sunlight and constant humidity inside these thick stone walls created ideal conditions for fungi and damp smells to thrive. This isn't the fresh, airy castle you might have imagined. Leather goods, like belts, boots and saddles, also contributed their own notes, earthy, slightly sour and occasionally sharp, if the leather had started to rot or was treated with substances like beeswax or tallow. Think of it as medieval eau de toilette, but far less appealing. You catch a faint waft of burning tallow candles mingling with all the other scents. These were the primary source of light inside, but their smoky, oily smell added another layer to the castle's aromatic chaos. Scholars still debate whether candle smoke actually made the air worse or helped disperse some odours by increasing ventilation. As you move deeper, you realise how these combined smells would have affected daily life, making the castle feel more alive, but also challenging to endure. Visitors might have been overwhelmed while residents became nose-blind to their own aromatic environment. So the next time you put on a leather jacket or smell metal tools, remember medieval castles carried their own signature scent, one you'd probably try hard to avoid. Yet it was as much a part of castle life as the stone walls and battlements. You step into the castle kitchens, where the mix of smells instantly shifts. This is the heart of medieval castle life. A place bursting with the aromas of food smoke, and well, something far less appetizing. Cooking fires filled the air with smoky wood and roasting meat, but they also created a haze that mingled with the other less pleasant odours. Historically, castle kitchens were massive affairs with open hearths where cooks prepared stews, baked bread and roasted game. The smoke from these fires often drifted through the halls, adding a persistent smoky layer to the castle's scent profile. Unlike modern kitchens with vents and exhaust fans, medieval kitchens relied on tall chimneys and open windows to clear the smoke, though this was far from perfect. A quirky tidbit kitchen refuse wasn't always disposed of quickly. Some scraps and food waste were thrown down into pits or outside the walls, attracting rats, cats, and a particularly tenacious smell. Historians still argue whether these pits were regularly cleaned or simply forgotten, leaving the stench to linger and intensify. You catch the scent of herbs hanging in bunches. Rosemary, thyme, sage attempts to mask or mitigate the overpowering aromas of cooking meat and stale smoke. These herbs were sometimes used as natural air fresheners, or even believed to have health benefits against bad air, a medieval concept linked to disease. The combination of smoke-cooked meat, rotting scraps, and the occasional hint of vinegar or ale creates a potent olfactory cocktail. You might think of a barbecue gone wildly wrong with a side of damp wool and centuries-old stone absorbing it all. You notice the occasional pungent whiff of urine, surprisingly common in kitchens, as servants and workers had to relieve themselves nearby, often with no separate facilities. This adds another layer to the already complex sensory experience, making it clear why visitors might have found castle kitchens overwhelming. Scholars still debate how much the kitchen's smells affected the rest of the castle. Did draughts carry the aromas throughout, or were they mostly contained? Evidence suggests that smoke and odours travelled surprisingly far, riding the castle's draughty corridors and staircases. As you move away, you're struck by how the kitchen was both a place of sustenance and stink, a chaotic blend of smells that kept castle life going, if not smelling very pleasant. You now wander into the castle's great hall, the grand centre of social life, where feasts and gatherings filled the air with a mix of human presence and less glamorous scents. Despite the grandeur, the Great Hall was far from a scented paradise. Here the aromas of food mingled with the heavy musk of hundreds of bodies packed into a stone chamber with little ventilation. A historical fact, these halls often hosted dozens, sometimes hundreds of people during banquets, with everyone seated on long benches or standing shoulder to shoulder. Human sweat, unwashed hair, and the general funk of medieval personal hygiene joined forces with the smells of roasted meats, spilled wine, and crushed herbs to create an olfactory assault. Here's a quirky tidbit. Nobles sometimes tried to combat this by burning fragrant herbs or sprinkling rosewater in the air. Medieval attempts at what we'd call air fresheners. Some would even toss scented gloves around or carry pomanders, small balls filled with aromatic spices, to mask the pervasive odours. Historians still argue whether these tactics were actually effective or mostly symbolic status displays. You can almost taste the sour edge of spilled ale and stale bread fermenting on the flagstones beneath your feet. The stone floors and wooden tables absorbed smells like giant sponges, slowly releasing them back into the air over hours and days. It's like walking into a medieval cologne bottle, only less inviting. The smell of burning torches or rushes laid on the floors to soak up spills adds another layer. Damp straw mingled with smoke and human odours. While rushes helped absorb liquids and soften the stone floor, they also contributed to the musty scent and had to be replaced regularly. Another often overlooked contributor, the castle dogs and cats. These animals prowled the great halls, leaving their own musky, furry signature behind, and sometimes the unmistakable whiff of a marking here and there. Their presence was welcomed for pest control, but added a new element to the scent landscape. Scholars still debate how the combination of odours influenced medieval etiquette and social interaction. Did the smells become part of the atmosphere people accepted, or did they contribute to social discomfort and hierarchy? As you linger, it's clear that the Great Hall was a vibrant sensory environment, rich in sound, sight, and most definitely smell. You probably wouldn't want to spend a day breathing this air non-stop, but it was the heart of medieval life. You find yourself climbing the narrow, winding stone staircase toward the upper chambers, the private quarters of the lord and his family. You might imagine these rooms to be fragrant retreats, but brace yourself. Medieval bedrooms were often just as pungent, just with a different flavour of stink. Historically, these rooms served multiple functions, sleeping dressing meetings, and were rarely cleaned in a way that modern noses would find tolerable. Bedding materials were stuffed with straw or feathers and infrequently changed. The damp, stuffy air trapped a mix of sweat body oils and the occasional lingering scent of unwashed clothes. A quirky fact: some wealthier castle dwellers tried to freshen the air by burning herbs or scattering lavender sachets, but these were more symbolic gestures than effective deodorizing strategies. Historians still argue how effective these methods really were, or if they were simply status symbols to demonstrate one's refinement. The chamber smells faintly of old wood candle smoke and a hint of urine due to the common practice of urinating in chamber pots at night and emptying them out the windows in the morning. Imagine the sharp, sour bite of this in the closed air, especially in colder months when windows stayed shut tight. You might also notice the faintest trace of animal hide or leather from the furniture, clothing, or even hunting gear stored inside. Unlike the fresh linens we're used to today, medieval textiles could hold on to odours for weeks or months. There's a strange, almost bittersweet undertone in these rooms, a combination of human sweat and faintly medicinal herbs used to ward off bad air, a medieval belief tied to illness. Some noble families even had special perfumers who prepared scented oils and powders, though historians still debate how widespread or accessible these luxuries really were. As you settle into the quiet gloom, you realize these chambers weren't escapes from the harsh smells of the castle. They were part of the same pungent ecosystem, just wrapped in thicker velvet curtains and more elaborate furnishings. You wouldn't exactly want to linger here all day, but it was home. You descend back down and head toward the castle kitchens where the real sensory chaos begins. The heart of medieval culinary activity, the kitchen was a furnace of heat noise and an overwhelming melange of smells that would assault any modern nose. Historical fact: castle kitchens were often separate buildings, or at least well-ventilated spaces, designed to keep the smoke and smells away from the living quarters. But even so, the sheer volume of food preparation generated odours that seeped through every crack and crevice. Large open hearths blazed day and night, roasting meats, boiling stews, and baking bread on rough stone surfaces. A quirky detail: cooks sometimes used animal dung as a fuel source, especially when wood was scarce, adding an unmistakable tang to the air. This fact has historians debating just how much that contributed to the general stench versus the usual smoke from wood fires. You step closer to the sizzling cauldrons and catch the sharp tang of burning fat mixed with the sweet yeasty smell of fresh bread. But underneath it all lies something darker: the unmistakable funk of rotting meat. Preservation was a constant challenge, and while salted or smoked meats were common, any lapse meant decay and rancid odours. Rats and other vermin scavenged scraps, adding their own unpleasant smells. Then there's the fish. Not fresh, mind you, but salted or dried, hanging from hooks or piled in barrels. The salty, briny stench of cured fish filled the air, a smell that has haunted kitchens since ancient times. You catch a faint waft of herbs and spices, garlic, mustard seeds, peppercorns used to mask or counterbalance the less appetizing aromas. Medieval cooks knew a thing or two about covering up smells, but historians still argue whether these efforts truly improved the atmosphere or simply layered one set of pungencies over another. Finally, there's the human factor. the sweat and grime of cooks and kitchen servants often working in cramped, hot and poorly ventilated conditions, adding a very human musk to the overall aroma. As you step away from the kitchen doorway, you realise the phrase "nose burned off" might have medieval origins, or at least it should. The kitchen was a battleground of odours, a place where hunger fought against stench every single day. Now you move to the castle's latrines, a subject everyone tiptoes around, but which played a major role in medieval castle life and smell. Latrines, or guardrobes as they were called, were basic by modern standards but essential nonetheless. Historically, garderobes were small chambers built into the thickness of castle walls, with holes in the floor leading straight down into the moat cesspit, or sometimes just a pit. You might think that's the end of the problem, but here's where medieval ingenuity meets foul reality. The waste often didn't get flushed away properly, and on hot days the smell from these latrines could rise and invade nearby rooms. A quirky tidbit: some garderobes were equipped with small wooden seats carved for comfort, though comfort was a relative term. And in some castles, occupants used communal sponges on sticks rinsed in water, between uses, an idea that's rather gross by today's standards. Historians still argue whether this was common practice or more limited to specific regions or classes. You inch closer and catch the unmistakable odours of ammonia and decay, sharp, eye-watering and persistent. The smell was exacerbated by the constant presence of flies and other insects that thrived in such damp, waste-filled environments. The location of latrines often meant that foul smells travelled upward through the castle, especially if the wind was wrong or ventilation poor. Sometimes latrine waste was emptied into the moat, which might seem clever until you realise that was also the castle's drinking water source, for some residents a medieval recipe for disease. Interestingly, some castles had night soil, men workers tasked with cleaning out cesspits and removing waste to the outskirts of towns. This was a hazardous and smelly job that few envied, yet it was critical for the castle's sanitation. As you step away, you realise medieval latrines were not just smelly nuisances, but a genuine public health hazard, contributing to outbreaks of disease and making life inside the castle less pleasant than you might have imagined. You press on toward the castle's great hall, the social heart of medieval life, where the smells tell a different story, one of power feasting and a desperate attempt to mask less savoury odours. The great hall, a cavernous space with high ceilings and massive wooden beams, was filled with the scents of burning torches, spilt ale, and an array of foods being devoured by lords, ladies, and their retainers. Historical fact: these halls often lacked chimneys, so smoke from hearth fires mingled with everything else, creating a dense, smoky atmosphere that hung thick like fog. A quirky tidbit: nobles often tried to combat the smells with perfume balls, which were small scented pouches or pomanders filled with herbs and spices that they would carry or hang around their necks. This trend led to some comical combinations, as people walked around smelling like a walking spice rack. Historians still argue whether these perfumes actually helped or simply added another layer of complex odours to the mix. As you breathe in, you detect the sweet, yeasty scent of spilled mead mixing with the heavy musk of unwashed bodies. Hygiene was not the medieval's strong suit, and after hours of drinking, sweating and shouting, the Great Hall could become a veritable petri dish of human odour. Then there's the food, the roasted meats dripping with fat, the stale bread crushed underfoot, the pungent cheeses left out too long. The servants struggled to keep the space clean, but with hundreds of people passing through daily, the smells were nearly impossible to escape. A debate among scholars centres on how stinky the Great Hall really was, with some suggesting that the nobility's use of perfumes and frequent feasts made it surprisingly bearable, while others argue that for most it was a nightmare of smells that only improved with the advent of chimneys and better sanitation centuries later. You can't help but feel a little claustrophobic just imagining the layers of smell crowding the air, reminding you that power and privilege didn't come with pleasant aromas in the Middle Ages. As you wander deeper into the shadowy chambers of the castle, your nose begins to pick up something distinctly less savoury animal odours. Horses, pigs, dogs, and even cats were all part of castle life, and their smells added an unmistakable layer of pungency. Stables were usually located near or under the castle walls for ease of access, and historical records tell us that manure and urine were often piled up nearby, sometimes even used as a crude form of fuel or fertilizer. The smell. A mix of ammonia, damp hay, and the unmistakable musk of livestock, all steeped in the thick, sometimes stagnant air. A quirky fact is that some castles had special muck holes where animal waste was deposited and occasionally collected to be spread on nearby fields. It's one of those medieval, eco-friendly practices that's both ingenious and pungent. Historians still debate how frequently these muck holes were emptied. Some believe they were managed fairly regularly, while others argue that waste build-up contributed significantly to the castle's foul atmosphere. As you imagine yourself walking past these stables, the horse sweat and manure almost seem to cling to your clothes, mingling with the lingering scents from the latrines. Cats kept to control vermin contributed their own musty odours, sometimes blending with the more intense scents of rodents who thrived in the grain stores. In fact, vermin like rats and mice were as much a part of the castle ecosystem as the nobles themselves attracted by the steady supply of food and shelter. Their droppings and urine added to the olfactory assault, and their presence posed ongoing challenges for sanitation and health. You can't help but wonder if the medieval castle was less a majestic fortress and more a complex stew of smells with animal odours playing a starring role. It's one thing to imagine castle life's grandeur, but quite another to deal with the everyday stench that came along with it. You find yourself stepping into the dimly lit castle chapel expecting a sanctuary of peace and fresh air. But instead, the smells here tell a story just as complicated as the rest of the castle. Historically, chapels were often tucked into castles without much ventilation. The incense used during services made from fragrant resins like frankincense and myrrh filled the space with a heavy, smoky aroma intended to purify and sanctify. But oddly enough, the incense didn't entirely mask the less spiritual scents lurking in these stone walls. Here's a quirky tidbit. It was common for chapel floors to be covered in straw or rushes that were rarely changed, absorbing every drop of moisture, sweat, and yes, urine that might find its way inside. This practice made the chapel smell faintly of damp hay mixed with the sharpness of stale sweat, and sometimes well more embarrassing smells. Historians still argue whether these coverings were primarily practical or had symbolic religious meaning. You breathe in slowly, detecting the clash of sweet incense with the sour tang of dampness and neglect. Imagine kneeling on a patch of straw that's absorbed decades of devotion and everything else. The contrast between the intended holiness and the earthy reality is striking. And then there's the choir. Singing bodies heavy with sweat from cramped conditions added their own musky contribution. Medieval worship was a sensory experience, not just for the ears and eyes, but for the nose as well, sometimes in ways you probably wouldn't choose to experience. Scholars debate how much of this was accepted as normal versus a tolerated inconvenience. Was the scent of the chapel a reminder of the imperfect human condition, or just an unfortunate side effect of medieval castle life? You step away momentarily comforted by the lingering fragrance of incense, but also reminded that even sacred spaces couldn't escape the castle's aromatic chaos. You trudge along the chilly stone walls toward the castle's prison or dungeon, as popular legend insists, ready to confront yet another layer of the olfactory nightmare. Historically, castle prisons were grim, cramped, and wet. These dank spaces often lacked proper drainage or ventilation, leading to a near-permanent haze of foul odours, urine, excrement, mould, and the unmistakable stench of human despair. Prisoners might be held for months or years in these conditions, which, let's be honest, sounds like a brutal punishment even without the threat of torture. Here's a quirky tidbit: some medieval castles used cesspits directly beneath prison floors, hoping to contain waste. But this often backfired, as gases and smells would rise through the floorboards or cracks enveloping the entire dungeon. You'd think there'd be a no-gas warning sign, but alas, it was centuries before anyone figured that out. Historians still argue whether all castles even had proper prisons, or if some simply used makeshift holding cells in towers or basements. Regardless, the consensus is that none of these spaces were designed with comfort or hygiene in mind. You can almost taste the damp, sour air as you imagine the prisoner's ordeal surrounded by the smell of their own filth, with only the occasional rush of fresh air when the door creaks open. It's a harsh reminder that medieval justice was as much about humiliation and discomfort as it was about punishment. The presence of vermin rats, cockroaches, and fleas added another layer to the aroma disaster. These pests thrived in the darkness, carrying diseases that only worsened the prisoner's fate. Medieval castles were in many ways breeding grounds for germs long before anyone had the idea of clean. Despite the horror, some records mention prisoners trying to improve their quarters with small comforts like herbs or even scraps of fabric. But these were drops in a very smelly ocean. You step back from the dungeon's shadowy entrance, your nose wrinkling involuntarily, realizing that the castle's darker corners were no refuge from the pervasive stench. You wander into the bustling heart of the castle, the Great Hall, a place meant for feasting celebration and loud declarations of power, yet smelling like a medieval nightmare. Historically, the Great Hall was the social hub, often filled with the mingling scents of roasting meat, spilled ale, sweat, and the not-so-subtle fragrance of unwashed bodies. Imagine dozens of people squeezed together wearing layers of wool and leather, heating the room not just with fire, but with their collective body heat and odour. A quirky fact here, it wasn't uncommon for nobles to throw bones or scraps from their meals directly onto the floor where dogs and rats would happily scavenge. The leftovers fermented into a rich stew of smells that surely would make any modern nose recoil. Historians still argue whether the floor throwing was a deliberate display of generosity or simply a result of limited waste disposal options. You inhale the mixed bouquet, the sweet aroma of honeyed wine blending awkwardly with the sourness of spilled mead and the pungency of unwashed armpits. It's a chaotic perfume that defines medieval festivity with a hint of desperation underneath. The smoky haze from torches and fireplaces adds a dry, acrid layer to the smellscape, making the air feel thicker than it looks. You almost feel the grit settling on your tongue as you imagine the din of laughter and loud conversation competing with the clatter of dishes and clinking of goblets. There's a popular debate among scholars about how much effort was actually put into cleaning the Great Hall. Some records suggest daily sweeping and occasional washing, but others hint that these duties were minimal at best, leaving the room's scent to grow steadily more potent over days and nights of use. You can't help but chuckle thinking how this olfactory chaos probably played a role in medieval politics. If you could survive a night in the Great Hall's atmosphere, you were clearly tough enough for anything. You climb up the narrow winding stairs to the Lord's private chambers, expecting maybe a reprieve from the general stench, but no such luck. These rooms, although more refined in decoration, carried their own unique bouquet of medieval living. Historically, Lord's chambers were often layered with tapestries, animal hides, and wooden furniture that absorbed and trapped odours over time. The warmth from the fireplace mixed with the scent of unwashed linens and human sweat, creating a rather heavy, musky atmosphere. The nobles might have had servants regularly changing linens, but given the technology of the time, fresh was relative. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some lords and ladies would hang fragrant herbs and flowers near their beds, like lavender or rosemary, in an attempt to mask the less pleasant smells. However, these botanical interventions often just mingled oddly with the stronger underlying odours, creating a scent profile that historians affectionately call medieval perfume gone wrong. Historians still argue whether these herbs genuinely improved air quality or simply offered psychological comfort. As you settle into this space, you notice a faint trace of smoke from the fireplace, mixed with the faintly sour smell of old leather. A reminder that castle life never really escaped its earthy primal roots. The damp stone walls might have been cold to the touch, but they also held on to moisture, making the entire room feel slightly dank and encouraging the growth of mould, which lent its own musty undertones. And yes, don't forget the ever-present possibility of nearby chamber pots, which, despite attempts at discretion, inevitably contributed to the room's scent profile. The flush system hadn't been invented yet, and waste disposal was a constant challenge. Sometimes chamber pots were emptied out of the windows, which must have been a pleasant surprise for anyone walking below. Imagining yourself trying to get a good night's sleep here, surrounded by all these scents, makes you appreciate modern air fresheners and maybe a hot shower more than ever. You step onto the castle battlements, expecting fresh air and perhaps relief from the indoor odours, but even out here the medieval scent story continues in full force. Historically, battlements were not just defensive perches, but also spots where soldiers relieved themselves during long sieges or patrols. Human waste, animal dung, and the occasional forgotten food scraps mingled with the salty breeze from nearby rivers or seas. The winds carried these aromas across the castle grounds, blending the natural world with the less savoury realities of medieval life. Here's a quirky fact. Some castles had guardrobes latrines built right into the battlement's edges where waste dropped directly down the walls straight into the moat or the rocks below. This architectural convenience was a recipe for odour disasters, especially on hot days. Historians still argue whether these designs were more about practicality or sheer disregard for hygiene. The smell of the battlements was a complicated mix, salt air mixed with the acrid stench of human waste and animal odours from horses and guard dogs. You might catch a whiff of gunpowder residue as well, especially in later medieval periods when early firearms began to appear. The scent was a grim reminder that war and daily life were never far apart in these stone fortresses. The wind sometimes carried faint floral or woodsy notes from nearby forests or gardens, providing small but fleeting relief. Yet those natural smells were quickly overwhelmed by the harsher odours clinging to the stone battlements, making the fresh air more of a cruel joke than a true breath of relief. You might be surprised to learn that some guards reportedly used cloth soaked in vinegar or herbs held to their noses during their shifts, an early form of odour management. While this might seem amusing today, it shows that medieval people were well aware of their smelly environment and made some effort to cope. As you take in this rough blend of smells, you realise that medieval castle life, indoors and out, was an olfactory adventure you probably wouldn't want to sign up for voluntarily. You wander into the castle's great hall expecting grandeur and maybe a faint trace of wood smoke, but instead you're greeted by a thick melange of scents that tell a far more complicated story. Historically, the Great Hall was the heart of social life, a place for feasting meetings and storytelling. The walls absorbed the smells of countless meals, spilled ale, and the inevitable odours of large crowds gathered in one place. Without modern ventilation, the combination of sweat food and animal hides created an atmosphere both vibrant and pungent. One quirky tidbit: some great halls featured large hearths with enormous cauldrons simmering over the fire, not just for cooking, but also for heating the air. This made the space warmer but also intensified the mingling smells of cooking spices, burnt wood, and unwashed bodies. Historians still argue whether these hearths improved the hall's atmosphere or made it worse by circulating the smells more aggressively. The air was heavy with the aroma of roasted meats, like boar or venison, but also with less appetizing scents: grease dripping from cooking spilled wine, fermenting on the floor, and even the occasional waft from the latrines located nearby or beneath. You can almost taste the medieval equivalent of ode to chaos lingering in the air. Despite these less-than-pleasant elements, the Great Hall was often decorated with fresh herbs and flowers during special occasions to mask the smell. But these attempts were temporary and often only served to mix strange odours rather than eliminate them. The noise and movement of people might distract from the olfactory assault, but if you stopped and breathed deeply, the scent would be unmistakable. A vivid reminder that medieval social life was lived in close quarters with all the smells that implies. Imagining yourself seated at one of those massive wooden tables trying to enjoy a feast while your nostrils wrestle with this complex scent landscape, you begin to understand why the idea of fresh air was something many medieval folks could only dream about. You finally retreat to the castle's private chambers, hoping for some relief from the relentless medieval smells. But alas, even here, the scent story refuses to let up. Historically, private chambers were often small, poorly ventilated rooms with heavy tapestries and thick curtains designed to keep out drafts and cold. While these textiles added some insulation, they also trapped moisture, smoke, and the odours of daily life inside the confined space. The walls absorbed the mingling smells of sweat, unwashed linens, and the faint but persistent scent of chamber pots used overnight. A quirky detail, some nobles used scented sachets or dried herbs tucked into their bedding to try and mask these odours, but the effectiveness was hit or miss at best. Historians still argue whether these fragrant additions truly improved comfort or were merely symbolic luxuries to cover up the realities of hygiene. The air in these chambers often smelled of burning tallow candles or rushes strewn on the floor, both of which added their own smoky or grassy aromas to the mix. And remember, there was no such thing as indoor plumbing here. Chamber pots had to be emptied manually, sometimes leading to unpleasant surprises if accidents occurred during the night. You might imagine that noble chambers would be a refuge from the harsher castle smells, but in truth they were just quieter spaces filled with the same persistent odours, only more concentrated in the smaller room. As you lie back, perhaps trying to settle into an uneasy sleep, the blend of scents swirls around you, a patchwork of wood smoke, stale air, animal musk, and faint hints of lavender or rosemary desperately trying to assert themselves. Thinking back over your castle tour, you realise that medieval castles were sensory worlds defined as much by their smells as by their stones and stories. The aromas might have been a nightmare, but they were also part of the lived reality, an olfactory history waiting to be understood. Now, as you prepare to drift off, just remember you probably won't find that kind of ambiance in your modern bedroom anytime soon. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together.